Welcome back, attractive and well-educated watchers, to a brand new scenario. We've teased at this before over on our own channel and would generally leave it to a poll on Patreon. However, recently we've been talking with Alterarc and decided that we should take over his channel for a brief bit to focus on a scenario both of us will be covering in our own way. America's Perfect Timeline. That's right, a subject very near and dear to our own heart. What if everything went perfect for the US of A? Now, Alterarc and ourself have very different opinions of when the points of divergence would be, so instead of fighting over it, we both decided that we would be adults and agree to compromise. He will do his scenario on Un-RealHistory, and here on Alterarc, we will tell you what we personally think America would look like after a few decades of being fucking perfect. So, get ready, Alterarc fans, for a Philosophy guest special. First and foremost, we gotta figure out the point of divergence for this. And weirdly, it's sorta 2 points of divergence. Because if we want America to have its perfect timeline, a couple people are necessary to start it off. Meet Alexander John Forsyth and Jean Samuel Pauly. These guys are some of the true fathers of modern firearms, and they will be integral to pulling America ahead in this timeline. Alexander John Forsyth, you see, is responsible for the application of fulminates into firearms technology. He made the primer. Sadly, he was dismissed from employment at Tower Armories in 1806 because his new superior didn't want the British arsenal exploding. His loss! In this timeline, Alexander John Forsyth decides to take his designs and go to America. And the American government loves hiring people who accidentally blow things up. That's how we got the Jet Propulsion Lab at NASA. No joke, look it up. And Samuel Pauly, you see, he made the first self-contained bullet cartridge. Originally, he designed this with French gunsmith François Prellet, but we'll say in this timeline the two had a simple falling out, and Samuel Pauly decided he might find better partnership for his designs in America. And, delighted to have him as well, the American government decides to put the two of them together in a shack in the northern Appalachian mountain range where they can get some privacy and seclusion for their work. But some smart dude in the government thinks this isn't far enough. We got two amazing people already, so why not make this power duo into a think tank? The American government sends out requests all over their territory to call in folks who might be able to design the next generation of firearm for America! And they are not disappointed at who responds. For you see, there were some really amazing firearms inventors at the time. Real godfathers of modern firing systems, you see. Eli Whitney, normally known for the cotton gin, was already contracted to make firearms for the US government at this time, having begun to develop the concept of interchangeable parts for the easy manufacture and repair of military guns. Though the cotton gin had already been a mainstay in the South for a bit, facilitating the rise of slavery, Eli Whitney lamented that his otherwise good-natured attempt to make slavery obsolete only made it more popular. After making it clear with his fellows what his opinions are, he joins up with three other remarkable figures in firearms history. Alongside him comes Simeon North, a gunsmith and engineer who would go on contract to start making pistols for the US in 1809, but in this timeline, ends up getting to gunsmithing for Uncle Sam a bit earlier. He would not, in our own timeline, come to invent the milling machine for 10 more years, but Whitney, also an individual credited with an independent milling machine design, would be able to work with North to create a working prototype some decade before we did. John H. Hall had not yet patented the mechanism for the first breech-loading rifle used in large numbers by a major nation's military. However, with the assistance of all of the wonderful gunsmiths and engineers here, he'd be able to move that design up quite a bit, and help to develop a new feed system as well, experimenting with the idea of tube and stock magazines that wouldn't start appearing until half a century later. Before Hall, most breech-loading mechanisms leaked a lot of gas and flames into the faces of the user, ensuring a less effective shot, but Hall helped produce seals and mechanical mechanisms that considerably mitigated this leakage. Finally, Henry Derringer heeds the call. joining the Appalachian think tank rather than starting his own business in 1808 like he did in our own timeline. While a lot of people don't really think about it, Henry Derringer is not just the producer of a very silly little double-shot pistol that only shows up in memes and niche action flicks. Henry Derringer was one of the first gunsmiths to really put stock into the idea of ergonomics, that a weapon should feel good in the hand and be comfortable as a primary priority because discomfort causes distractions, which in turn lowers performance. We might not think of this as very important today, but we cannot stress enough that some Civil War firearms were considered complete and total garbage, even though they had vastly superior fire rates because they had no wooden grips, no padded stocks, nothing to make the gun easier and more comfortable to hold. This would result in overheating barrels, burning the hands of their users in mid-combat, stuck cartridges that people would need to pry out with special tools, uncomfortable handles, and sometimes arm burns from accidentally touching the hot parts of the barrel with your arm. In this think tank, however, those concerns are brought up very early on by one of the first people to really consider such things in early modern warfare. So comfortable and successful were his guns in our own timeline, at least compared to others at the time, that the public bought them literally as fast as he could make them. And after 3 years of fiddling about in the bowl of Mount Katahdin in the Highlands of Maine, our star-spangled group of gunsmiths will have produced the M1811 Appalachian, a tube-fed lever-action repeating rifle that holds 15 shots with a grip and stock of maple for comfort when firing and to avoid the barrel overheating in the hand. They are all built to the same standard, with the same cast bullets and casings, the same exact dimensions for every barrel, and the same stocks and mechanisms. No longer will the American soldier cast their own bullets or load their own guns from the front. Now, we're stepping into the real next generation of firearms. This is the closest thing to a modern firing system that they have, catapulting the USA 50 years into the firearms development future, with these sort of weapons not being developed in our own timeline until the latter half of the American Civil War. And, for the record, we're not really moving things forward that hard. All of these guys were alive and practicing their craft already, each having made amazing developments in the progress of engineering and ballistics in their time. Each of them did their part to develop a pivotal part of firearms progress, but none of them met each other. We never got these guys in a shack in the middle of northern Appalachians and told them, hey man, we're gonna send guys back twice a month to give you food and whatever parts you need. In the meantime, you do you. If that had happened, we'd have got the modern gun way earlier, as these are all the guys who invented the individual parts and processes that would eventually all be put together to make the modern firing system. The M1811 might be a bit clunky and a tad bit testy in bad conditions, but it's a fast-firing, consistent, and recognizably modern weapon that, to our modern-day perception, might look a bit old, but it wouldn't look like anything we'd consider for the early 1800s. This is something we might imagine from the early 1900s, something good old boys may have taken to the First World War. And that is going to make all the difference when you remember that it comes into full production exactly 1 year before the War of 1812. The conditions, of course, don't change. There being a single-arms factory in central Maine punching out the next-generation weapons under a secret US military think tank doesn't stop the tension between the old world and the new, nor does it stop the dreadful British practice of impressment that inevitably led to the whole debacle in the first place. None of these conditions stops the British encouragement of Native Americans at the interior, and it certainly doesn't dissolve the blockade of France that was stalling trade with Napoleon's empire. So James Madison still declares war on June 18, 1812, and the war kicks off in fairly similar fashion to our own timeline. Thereafter, however, everything diverges from our timeline quite quickly. Historically, neither side was particularly ready for the war. America's army wasn't very good at the time, and the actual official military force was barely over 15,000 men. Congress expanded it to 35,000, but it was still a pretty shit job and nobody really wanted to do it, so the military at large was understaffed and underpaid. Meanwhile, many militias, which were supposed to pick up the slack, weren't super jazzed about this whole war affair, and some outright just said no and stayed home. Britain, in the meantime, was held down by the Napoleonic Wars, over in the Iberian, where they were trying to hold down the peninsula with a blockade and were largely having a tough time of things. People did not like the idea of carrying out a second war across the pond. However, in this timeline, things are different. While riots would still go down, and stiff American sentiment against the war would prevail in certain parts, the lack of preparation on the American side will not be present. Instead, General William Hull will march on Canada in the Western Front with good supplies and new weapons provided by the U.S. military. The M18 Appellation, called the U.S. Apple, or just the Apple by its users, proves a fantastic addition to the U.S. arsenal during the first exchanges of the war. A well-built, accurate, largely predictable gun with clean, conveniently self-contained ammunition, which feels good in the hand and puts lead into the air at no less than 5 times the rate of fire the Brits can bring to bear, and at twice the range. The Brown Bess, standard for the United Kingdom's forces at the time, cannot compare to a weapon that mirrors the overall firing potential of the late Henry repeating rifle, for which it was said you could load it on Sunday and fire all week. However, unlike the Henry rifle, the Apple is much more comfortable in the hand, and the barrel never gets too hot to hold. And it comes out 49 years early. More than that, it is quickly learned that Canadians will target, quote, a bushel of apples, unquote, a lot less often than they'll target, quote, a crate of appellations, unquote. So the opening steps of the war experienced surprisingly little issues on the logistical front, giving the Americans a distinct advantage before the Canadians catch on to the slang. Because of this, the immediate bulk of the war in Canada is an absolute smash. Canadian forces are unable to catch on fast enough to find out what the hell is going on with American guns, and every engagement they enter ends up chewing them up entirely. In our own timeline, the maybe 9,000 or so British regulars stationed in Canada alongside the Canadian militia was spread across the entirety of the Canadian frontier. And while outnumbered considerably in our own timeline, they held their own quite well for a time. Not so in this timeline. The regulars and Canadian militiamen will be shredded by the first advances, leaving the defenders little choice but to either flee into the woods, flee into the North Atlantic to send word back home, or surrender. There are still 15,000 Indigenous defenders throughout the Canadian wilderness, and the American militia are more than happy to line up for their apples and take a bite out of the enemy. And with the drastic successes, militias are fast to form up and join the fighting. Before long, the soft trickle of uncertain militiamen that we experienced in our own timeline becomes a flood of people rolling in to ready themselves for war against the countrymen of their forefathers. Serving in the war and holding the apple of your eye becomes a point of pride with Americans from the industrializing North, and the war becomes so hilariously lopsided in favor of the American cause in just a few months that the British decide that Napoleon is worth more attention and leave the war entirely. Even in our own timeline, the Europeans regarded 1812 as a bit of a sideshow to the real conflict, the Napoleonic Wars. In this timeline, the British end up deciding that it's just not worth it. Canada's not worth that much anyway, and Napoleon is tearing Europe apart in his anti-monarchist sentiments. They can give America what it wants and leave the New World alone for a bit if it means destroying Napoleon as he limps back from his failed invasion of Russia, which will be happening about as this alternate war of 1812 ends late in the same year that it began. The Americans just blitzed things too fast, and the British were already tied down with a much bigger fish to fry. Now the various confederacies and native coalitions of North America will have to take care of themselves, and Canada will be ceded in its entirety to the United States. While this may seem like a great defeat for the British, and it certainly is in the grand scale of things, it also preserves many experienced British soldiers and nearly the entirety of the British Navy to fight Napoleon, catching him off guard as he returns from his lost campaign in the east after breaking through the Danish blockade of the Baltic and traveling up the Vistula in an unprecedented and dangerous maneuver with the Swedes, who have joined in the coalition against Napoleon a bit earlier at the encouragement of the returning British Navy. After punching a hole through Central Europe and striking at the heart of Poland in the dead of winter, the British and Swedish forces square up against the battered, starved, exhausted, and undersupplied Napoleonic forces on December 10th, just as they arrive in Warsaw, blocking their way to the city and facing them in open field combat. Already having taken such terrible casualties at this point, despite the overwhelming numbers in his favor, Napoleon's forces are completely destroyed in the dead of winter, and Napoleon's body is found in the nearby forests, having tried to flee the chaos but being hit by a stray bullet in the retreat and bleeding out alone and out of sight. With this, the Grand Armée and its leader is defeated. The continental system falls, and monarchism grips the European continent harder than ever. The Royalists will use this time to spread mass propaganda of the clear superiority of monarchy and hereditary rule, scraping back their power and establishing harsher control over the people than ever before. Napoleon had tried to defeat the monarchies of Europe, and had been so close to doing so. But inevitably, just as with so many other forces, it pales in comparison to divine right. For now, Europe will be able to mind its own business, and go on to do whatever it will do. But back in America, things are not sunshine and daisies. You see, taking the grand total of British Canada, moving into the plains, and incorporating countless square miles of freed land, creates a power imbalance between the northern and southern states. Yes, we have to address this. The northern states don't want slavery, and adding all of Canada to the registry would preserve power in the north, admitting more voting representatives who would threaten the now booming slave industry in the South, thanks to Eli Whitney's own cotton gin. And the southern slave states cannot take that. But of course, we don't have to fight each other over it. You see, there's much more land. All this land to the west and south. Only thing that's in the way? New Spain. And New Spain was an ally to the British, and vehemently hateful against the Napoleonic cause. The cause that was nominally an American ally. So obviously, the USA can just continue their assault on the rest of the North American continent and take the South. Sure, they're having that whole Mexican War for Independence thing, but it's literally only 3 years in and doesn't look like it's gonna stop anytime soon, so perhaps it's best for the good old US of A to get some early practice on that world police job it's been considering. After all, nobody in New Spain can stop them for the exact same reasons that the British lost in a matter of months. American morale is high, production of the new rifles is at maximum capacity, and people are volunteering for service faster than new guns can be made for them. But that leaves this whole, this whole open patch here in the best and most fruitful part of North America. All these various Indians just sort of hanging out, slave or freed. We can't have that. So perhaps it's best to just, speed run those Indian wars. Most of that is northerly, so it's also probably best if the South takes the rest of Central America right down to the Darien, while the unofficial Mason-Dixon line is further extended down between Missouri and Kansas, and then west along the 37th parallel, right until it reaches the Pacific coast, just south of modern-day San Jose. Which, of course, naturally makes the North look up to Russian Alaska, because there were literally not more than a few thousand Russians in the entirety of Alaska at any given point in time during much of the first half of the 1800s. Not like the Russians were really using it. So an offer is made, in money, but the Russians will be turning that down so soon after defeating Napoleon. War it is. And a war that the Russians simply cannot possibly win, given their need to bolster the West against the rising tension and ambition of the now re-monarchist Europe, alongside the fact that Russian guns are backward and pitiful compared to the new Appalachian firearms being pumped out of the North at a near constant rate. By 1820, just 8 years after smashing the British and laying claim to all of the continent for their own, The United States of America has slaughtered their way from sea to shining sea, with a fast-firing, easy-to-manufacture weapon of mass destruction that ranges at 200 yards accurately and has 5 times the rate of fire of any other gun in the world. It's so futuristic by contemporary comparisons that captured Appalachians are usable only until their ammunition runs out before they become functionally useless to the enemy. And actually making one and the bullets it uses is far beyond other powers of the world at the time. Furthermore, the US government will do anything to keep its manufacture private and secret. Nobody actually knows where the factory is, and those who do are highly paid, extremely loyal Northerners with notoriously anti-Southern sentiments and who probably don't know half of the production process in the first place. Blueprints are kept in secret locations, and no single part of the entire formula ever in the same place at the same time. In actuality, the only people who know how to make an M1811 Appalachian from scratch, from start to finish, are the 6 men who pioneered the device, and now hold the very fate of the world in their hands. So we are not exaggerating when we say that the US Army would absolutely sweep the continent from the Darien to the Northern Lights in just under a decade, stretching their manpower to its absolute limit and incorporating numerous native tribes amazed by the speed and ferocity of their advance, while chasing the rest right to the edge of the world before subjugating them entirely. But this will not be an easy, fun, friendly, nice advance. It won't even be the disgustingly violent and morally unforgivable Trail of Tears. It will be much worse. The United States will manifest its destiny across the North American continent harder than any force before or since. And they aren't making deals. The native coalitions that once served the British are now completely out on their ear, and they cannot rely on foreign powers to save or support them. Tecumseh's Confederacy is annihilated to a man, and the example made to all of the rest of the indigenous. Resistance will not be tolerated. Resistance is futile. There is no reservation for you. No new lands to be driven to, no trail to follow to a new home. You will not be given quarter, and you will not be given a second chance. Integrate or die. This will, without a doubt, lead to extreme civil unrest that will functionally cripple America's power projection off the continent until, well, something is done about it. Because this isn't just a matter of the common people being angry that there's so much bloodshed, that the land is being destroyed so hard for expansion, and that the infrastructure is not being expanded with them. Paradoxically, however, this alternate version of the Indian Wars is so fast and so terrifyingly brutal that most indigenous nations integrate before individual conflict ever plays out, for fear of the total slaughter that will assuredly come to them if they don't surrender immediately. They are all too aware that the American advance will not stop until it has absolutely nowhere else to go, and they have no illusions that anything short of the sea itself will halt them. Which means that the smart leaders of the natives quickly intuit that there is no endgame to running away. The mitigating factor to this is that Uncle Sam simply doesn't have the manpower and authority to exercise totalitarian cultural autocracy over the native people, as they did in our timeline. There are simply too many of them, and simply too few white Americans to maintain that sort of control, whilst simultaneously taking everything in every direction all at once forever. Native languages, traditions, and even religions, because of this, are maintained and preserved much more than in our own timeline, because America at large is simply too busy to do anything about it. There is simply too much Central America, too much Canada and Alaska to lay claim over in much more than name only. So, while some native tribes are entirely annihilated, many others survive in much larger numbers than they did in our own timeline, thanks to the true brutality of the American advance. We imagine in this timeline, more debate than ever will be placed on the idea of whether or not this nation is on stolen land. And surprisingly, there will be a remarkable number of natives that will take the position that it was not, while there will certainly be just as many people of European ancestry that will claim it was. No doubt, right into the modern era, this will be a contentious subject among all manner of people, of all cultures and ethnicities. We also have the fact that the North and South are now monsters. By 1830, when things begin to finally get stable under the yoke of the North's industrial might, a very real problem occurs. There's more northern land than southern land. Like, a lot more. And the North holds a monopoly on the manufacture of the best weapons in the world. With this imbalance, once again, America's population is at odds with itself, and there's no more land to expand to for them to kick the can down the road. The Caribbean is a tasty snack for the South, to be sure, but it's not going to balance the scales. There is considerably more land north of the 37th parallel, and it's pretty firmly free states now. So, in 1830, a coalition of Southern representatives demand the U.S. government construct a factory for the production of the M1811 appellation in the South, now updated after nearly 20 years of use and testing. How else are they supposed to maintain their own way of life, hold back the native menace, and otherwise exercise their alleged privileges and superiority over the other races? And Congress says no. The northern states cannot take the chance that the southern states will use their greatest weapon against them, and, of course, Eli Whitney, dead by this time but having left a much grander legacy in the North than in our own timeline, came into all of this with a very clear statement that his gun would never be used to support the slavers. Already, with the acquisition of so much land south of the 37th parallel, that statement had been disrespected. His estate will put its foot down now, and insist that the next factory be built in the North as well, and the one after that, and the one after that. The rest of the think tanks spend their own money lobbying the government, in Eli Whitney's memory, to pass legislation that the M1811 appellation never be constructed in any slave-owning state. Now, of course, this lobbying effort doesn't work, and even if it did, it would be quite moot because the government itself owns sole rights to the manufacture of the Apple rifle. But it sends the message to the South that they'll never be allowed equal measure next to the Union. And so, that very same year, Southern militias break into federal armories and forcibly take the capitals and forts throughout the South all the way to California, so as to begin a horrific march into the Northern Territories for, just as in our own timeline, states' rights. To own slaves! This alternate Confederate faction will be much bigger than in our own timeline, just as the Union will be. However, there are some noteworthy differences that will make this American Civil War a shorter, faster, louder, and far more bloody affair. You see, the new American southern states have a lot of extremely open, empty land to the north of them. The further inland you go, the fewer people there are to fight. And the hot badlands of the American Great Basin and rugged Rocky Mountain holdouts make for great places for southern forces to set up quick and dirty with a flag of victory. Though their weapons are completely out of date, and their tactics fairly rudimentary compared to the high-mobility, small-unit doctrine of the North, tensions with the newly integrated natives are still quite high, and labor is low out in the western portions of the continent, incentivizing slave labor in the struggling planter class. So the southern advance into the western interior will be fast and highly successful, with little resistance save for the natives, who try their best to stay out of trouble as much as possible, while understanding all too well that this war is very much a war of whites versus everyone else. While defending their lands in a guerrilla fashion as they do, the indigenous very clearly wait for the Union to put some sort of agreement on the table that will come to their aid. After the North absolutely smashes resistance in the American Southeast, thanks to the overwhelming manpower and industrial disparity between the two factions, Quite the opposite of in our own timeline where the Eastern Theater lasted much longer, they must spread out across the immense American West to root out and eradicate the Confederate infestations about the countryside. To facilitate this, they look to the aforementioned natives. It is a desperate gamble, but the US government cannot afford to let the barely stabilized frontiers of the nation go back to shit under the Confederate occupation. And so they offer legal representation and guarantees of legislative control to various native tribal authorities after Reconstruction is complete. If the Native Americans do everything they can to destroy each and every Confederate on the entire continent. A bounty system is established for Native Americans to kill confirmed Confederates in the West. Kill 100 confirmed Confederates, and you get yourself a freshly milled M1811 Appalachian repeating rifle right out of the factory just for you, buddy. Gleefully adopting the technology and fighting for the cause, the integrated natives do their part and end this alternative civil war by its third year, with their superior knowledge of the terrain and the resurgence of native warrior traditions syncretizing with US military combat doctrine. The entire time, the white Union soldiers, already quickly warming up to abolitionist sentiments in the most progressive of their population, start to see the distinct advantage of preserving native practices and culture, benefiting from the native Union volunteers teaching them superior survival skills while out on the march. Union soldiers then go to use these methods to stay healthier, eat better, and have a generally easier time navigating the West through their superior understanding of native languages and culture. Even looking past the few hopeful bright spots, however, the bulk of this conflict is like bleeding Kansas on the grandest scale imaginable. Union and Confederate soldiers alike rape and raze the countryside. People suspected of supporting either side are killed by their own on mere hunches and paranoia. Towns that are found to harbor a single Confederate soldier, some relative of the general store owner or the local pastor, are burned to the ground for supporting the slavers. And natives who fail to kill a Confederate soldier because of entirely humanistic reasons like, he's just a kid no older than my own son, those guys are publicly tortured and executed in front of their fellows for betraying the cause. Confederates found to sympathize with the Union or who simply want to stop fighting and go home are walked ahead of their columns without guns and used as human shields on the open field. M1811 Appalachian rifles captured in the field, since they cannot be fired more than what they already have loaded, are exclusively used to kill deserters and sympathizers to encourage more hatred toward the North and emphasize why this war is being fought, what they're fighting against. The Appalachian is the symbol of the North, and Southern gunsmiths spit in disgust at the very name. Throughout the South, apple trees are cut down en masse, and the eating of apples is publicly seen as a seditious form of silent protest rather than the simple enjoyment of a fundamentally American snack. Culturally, the last holdouts of the Southern resistance in the West last until 1835, but by that point the American Civil War has officially been over for the last 2 years, and the North is starting to bounce back from all the bloodshed thanks to increased support by integrated natives and a localized baby boom in the Great Lakes region that stokes the flames of hope for the Union's recovery. Reconstruction is so aggressive that it ultimately reshapes the entirety of the South from the ground up. The planter class is heavily disenfranchised, and majority property owners who took part in the war directly are stripped of their land, which is in turn split up and parceled out to former black slaves and indigenous who served in the war effort. Native American tribal authorities, as promised, are given preferential treatment in the oncoming rounds of elections after the induction of much of the West as a collection of newly christened states. With the assistance of this native leadership, the states are drawn differently than in our own timeline, with various native coalitions that share cultural history banding together to form contiguous blobs that better fit their self-accepted borders. Quickly, the Native American majority populations of those states bring forth elected leaders with long ethnic lineages on the American continent extending back for centuries, and their state constitutions and legislation will follow suit. The land will not be destroyed and repurposed solely for the agendas of the white man anymore, as the North American continent was never made for European land management practices. The great and beautiful natural wonders sacred to the natives before colonization would be protected and enriched, instead of destroyed like they were in our own timeline. And the traditional rights and privileges of certain religious and cultural classes will be preserved and enshrined into law so as to keep many native cultures from ever fading away like they did in our timeline. Instead of the highly Europeanized native jargon languages that we ended up with in our own timeline, much of the Pacific Coast natives, Puebloan peoples, and Plains natives remain entirely intact, inducting their own languages and holidays into the American identity, just as Spanish and Mexican culture have begun incorporating into modern America today. Through definitive force of arms, the Union upholds this new standard for the next 5 years, by which point Reconstruction is 7 years in and shows no chance of stopping. By 1840, though things have been exceedingly rough and an entire generation of broken men are finally starting to settle down after a long and difficult period of extreme conflict, the future of America finally looks hopeful. Slavery has been abolished, Reconstruction is going steady, the natives are integrating and syncretizing successfully, Central Americans and blacks are represented, and the United States of America is home to over 40 million people and growing every day. From sea to shining sea it stretches. From perilous Darien to the frozen North Pole itself, its borders extend. Though there are harsh feelings in some circles, a new generation of free Americans is being raised into a safer, more secure union that has established itself as a major power on the world stage, not only by destroying all of its foreign enemies in open warfare and establishing itself as a military force to be reckoned with, but by settling the problems within its own territory. Now, it just needs to sit back and relax for a decade or two and really, work on itself. Surely, nothing will cause any problems for them in the near future. Unless, people in the United States exploring expedition start getting killed by Polynesians in 1840. But we think 32 years of comprehensive change to this timeline is enough for now. Keep your eyes peeled for part 2 over on our own channel, Un-Real History. That's Unreal with a hyphen, history. Have a great night, and thanks for watching, everyone. Stay safe, stay inside, stay healthy, and remember to help each other. Bye!